The Tudor court shimmered like a jewel-golden tapestries, velvet-draped halls, and feasts where even the air seemed heavy with perfume and power. But beneath the glitter of Henry VIII's palace lay a far darker truth. Every pleasure came at a price, and every game carried the shadow of ruin. Imagine stepping into the great halls of Greenwich or Hampton Court. Torches flicker against carved oak. The scent of wine and spiced meats fills the air, and everywhere you look, nobles whisper, laugh, and wager. Gambling was not a pastime here. It was a currency of survival. At Henry's court, dice rolled like the heartbeat of politics, and cards could decide the fate of a family. Henry himself loved the thrill of games. He was not merely a king, but a gambler, a man who staked his pride, his money, and often his courtiers' fortunes on the turn of a card or the toss of a die. For him, victory at the gaming table was proof of divine favor, and loss was humiliation. No one dared defeat him too often. To win against the king was dangerous, but to lose too easily was worse. The courtiers understood this deadly paradox. Men and women of noble birth wagered vast sums, jewels, or even their horses, not out of reckless joy, but out of necessity. A noble who refused to play seemed aloof, suspicious, disloyal. To gamble was to prove one belonged, but to gamble meant risk, and those risks could destroy. Take Sir Henry Wyatt, for example, who once lost more than a year's income in a single night of cards. He staggered from the table pale as death, for he knew that in Henry's court, such a loss was not just financial. It marked him as weak, a man ripe to be manipulated by rivals or cast aside when influence mattered most. His fortune never fully recovered. Yet the danger did not end with empty purses. Gambling was a theater of reputation. Whispered accusations of cheating could bring disgrace, or worse, the wrath of the king. Dice carved from bone, cards inked with foreign symbols, tricks with hidden sleeves. The court was filled with suspicions. One rumor of dishonor, one suggestion of false play, and a courtier could vanish from favor overnight. But it was not only the men who played. Noble women, too, were drawn into these games of chance. The queen's ladies-in-waiting sat in glittering chambers, laughing over cards, their jewels clinking on the table, as they bet away brooches, rings, and even the gowns on their backs. For them, gambling was both escape and trap, a rare taste of agency in a world that confined them, but also a way to lose everything. Henry watched all of this with a predator's eye. His court was a stage, and gambling was one of his favorite performances. Sometimes he would sweep into the chamber himself, his great bulk cloaked in silks, his cheeks flushed with wine, demanding to play. Those who sat across from him knew the stakes were higher than gold. To anger the king over cards could mean banishment, imprisonment, or the slow death of being ignored. The irony was chilling. In a court where men lost fortunes in an instant, the greatest gambler of all was Henry himself. His entire reign was one long wager on wars he could not afford, on wives he could not keep, on heirs who never came. Every throw of the dice at his table echoed the gamble of his throne. And so, the Tudor court became a palace of chance. The laughter that rang out at midnight masked the desperation of men ruined in secret, the fear of women who pawned heirlooms to cover their debts, and the unspoken knowledge that the king's favor was the greatest gamble of all. For in Henry's world, every pleasure, every roll of dice, every sip of wine, every whispered bet might one day demand a payment in blood. If gambling was the heartbeat of Henry's court, then food was its swollen stomach. To dine with the king was to step into a theater of gluttony, a spectacle as dangerous as it was dazzling. Banquets stretched for hours, sometimes days, with entire herds roasted, mountains of sugar sculpted into castles, and swans presented gilded in gold leaf. The table was a battlefield of excess, where appetite became proof of wealth, and restraint looked like treason. But the true horror of Tudor dining was not just its extravagance, it was its peril. Every dish carried hidden dangers. Meat turned sour in the heat, fish spoiled before reaching the palace, and spices masked rot. To eat here was to risk illness, yet none dared refuse a royal plate. To push food aside in Henry's presence was to insult the majesty of the crown itself, and so courtiers smiled as they swallowed decay. Among the countless recipes whispered through the kitchens of Hampton Court, one remains infamous: the cucumber. Today it seems harmless, even refreshing, But in the 16th century, the cucumber was regarded with suspicion. Physicians called it cold, a dangerous food that could upset the balance of the humors, bringing weakness, fever, even death. To consume it was to gamble with health, and yet at Henry's feasts, the cucumber appeared as a fashionable delicacy, imported at great cost, dressed in vinegar and sugar, served to prove sophistication. Imagine the scene: long oak tables groaning under roasted boar, steaming pies and shimmering jellies. At the center, a dish of sliced cucumbers glistens, a novelty that nobles whisper about with nervous curiosity. Some laugh as they spear the strange green slices, eager to show daring before the king. Others hesitate, fearing the cucumber's dark reputation. To taste it is to prove loyalty, courage, even modernity. To refuse is to appear backward or worse, defiant. For Henry, food was more than sustenance. It was a weapon. He watched who ate and who refused, who feasted and who faltered. At his table, appetite was loyalty measured in mouthfuls. Courtiers who gorged themselves won his approval. Those who shrank from food risked his suspicion. And yet the king himself ate dangerously. His banquets, soaked in wine and heavy meats, fed the gout that crippled him, the ulcers that rotted his legs, the swelling body that became his prison. The very pleasures he demanded were killing him slowly. The kitchens beneath the palace mirrored this brutality. Fires roared day and night, boys turned to spits until their arms failed, and butchers waded through rivers of blood from slaughtered animals. Hundreds of servants labored unseen, their lives consumed to maintain the illusion of plenty above. The splendor of Henry's feast was built upon smoke, sweat, and the endless sacrifice of those too lowly to be noticed. And yet for the courtiers, the danger of the feast was not only physical, but symbolic. At these tables, alliances were made and broken. A seat near the king could raise a man to power. A seat at the margins could doom him to obscurity. To share food was to share fate. Every bite of cucumber, every swallow of venison, every drop of wine bound the court together in a pact of indulgence that few survived intact. The irony was cruel. In their hunger for favor, nobles poisoned themselves willingly. They feasted on disease, swallowed corruption, and called it privilege. And Henry, watching from his gilded chair, devoured more than food. He consumed loyalty, ambition, and fear until nothing was left but silence and the slow decay of bodies collapsing under the weight of pleasure. If gambling was risk and feasting was excess, then jousting was death dressed as entertainment. In the tilt yard, the Tudor court found its most dangerous stage. Here, men hurled themselves toward each other on war horses, splintering lances before the eyes of the king. It was not merely sport. It was theater, politics, and ritual, soaked in the constant possibility of blood. The lists were dazzling to behold. Painted stands draped in silk rose above packed crowds, where nobles and commoners alike pressed shoulder to shoulder, craning to glimpse the violence. Trumpets blared, banners cracked in the wind, and armored knights gleamed like living statues of steel. At the center sat Henry VIII, swollen with pride, eyes blazing with the thrill of combat. For him, jousting was the very soul of kingship. A king who excelled at the lists proved not only his strength, but his divine right to rule. But every tilt of the lance was a dance with death. Horses thundered forward, hooves striking the earth like drums of war. Wood shattered into clouds of splinters as steel crashed against steel. Knights fell, bones breaking, skulls fracturing inside their helmets. What the crowd called entertainment was in truth organized carnage. The joust was a place where glory and ruin were separated by inches, by the angle of a lance, by the twist of a horse's neck. The courtiers understood this well. To refuse the lists was to admit weakness, cowardice. To compete was to risk maiming or death, but it was also a chance at glory, at the king's fleeting favor. Young nobles flung themselves into combat not only for honor, but for survival in a court where hesitation looked like treachery. Henry himself was the most reckless of all. He adored the tilt, riding with a fury that seemed to deny mortality itself. In his youth he was unmatched, a towering figure who shattered lances and unhorsed rivals with terrifying power. Yet as the years passed, the game turned against him. The king's body grew heavy, his wounds more dangerous, his wrists more desperate. In 1536, a horse fell upon him during the joust, crushing him into the ground. For hours he lay unconscious, his courtiers whispering that England itself might die with him. He survived, but his body never recovered. His leg ulcers festered, his temper blackened. And the man who once embodied knightly glory became a grotesque shadow of himself. Still, the tournaments went on. Knights shattered their bodies for the fleeting ecstasy of applause, for the hope of being noticed by the king or adored by a lady in the stands. The air smelled of sweat and dust, of iron and blood. To the cheering crowd it was glory. To those who fell it was oblivion. The joust revealed the cruelest paradox of Henry's court, that death itself had become spectacle. Pleasure and violence were indistinguishable. The nobles risked their lives for fleeting favor, while the king, swollen with vanity, cheered as their blood darkened the sand. For in Tudor England, to live at court was to joust, forever charging blindly toward power, blinded by banners crushed beneath the weight of the crown. Above the games, beyond the banquets, higher than the tilt yard stood the crown. Heavy, glittering, and cruel, it was the ultimate pleasure of Henry's court, and the deadliest of all. Gold and jewels glimmered across its rim, but its weight crushed every head that dared to wear it. For Henry, the crown was not a symbol. It was his obsession, his addiction. He had gambled fortunes, feasted himself into disease, thrown his body into the lists, all to prove he alone was worthy of it. Every pleasure of his court, every display of power, was designed to magnify its glory. And yet the crown was never secure. It slipped with every failed war, every stillborn child, every whisper of rebellion. It demanded sacrifices, and Henry paid in flesh, wives executed, friends destroyed, rivals erased. To his courtiers, the crown was both light and fire. To serve it was to bask in radiance, to reach too close was to be burned alive. The same men who laughed at the gambling tables, who gorged themselves at feasts, who rode into the lists with reckless valor, all of them were playing the king's deadliest game. They pursued the crown's favor as if it were salvation, even as it devoured them one by one. And what of Henry himself? The king who once dazzled Europe with his youth and strength ended his reign bloated, ulcerous, and alone. His pleasures had consumed him. Gambling had emptied his coffers. Feasting had destroyed his body. Jousting had shattered his strength. Even the crown, that glittering prize, had become a shackle, binding him to paranoia and fear. He could not trust his wives, his friends, his heirs, even his own flesh. The crown he had worshipped left him haunted. In the silence after his death, the echoes of his pleasures remained. The gaming tables lay abandoned, dice scattered like bones. The great kitchens rotted with the smell of forgotten feasts. The tilt yard was empty, its sands stained with invisible blood. And the crown itself, locked in its coffer, gleamed coldly, a relic of pleasures that had killed a king and scarred a kingdom. This was the truth of Henry's court, that its pleasures were never innocent. They were traps, binding men and women in chains of vanity, greed, and hunger. Every laugh at the dice table, every bite of cucumber, every splintering lance beneath the banners, all were steps in a dance of death, choreographed by a king who could not stop consuming. And so the Tudor court remains in history not as a paradise of splendor, but as a theater of ruin. Its pleasures glowed brightly, but like a candle in the dark, they burned themselves out, leaving only ashes, silence, and the cold weight of a crown that never truly belonged to anyone.